Have you ever treated someone as invisible, only to discover that person could completely change your destiny? Rachel had no idea that the quiet man in the elevator held a secret that would transform her life forever. A simple act of kindness. A moment of misjudgment, a revelation that would leave the entire company in shock. This is the story of how a single moment of empathy can rewrite someone's future. A story that will touch your heart and remind you that sometimes the smallest gestures have the greatest impact. If you've ever been underestimated or overlooked, this story is for you. Get ready for a twist that will leave you speechless. What can a simple act spark in a world ruled by appearances? The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Rachel Martinez stepped into the maze of cubicles that defined her daily reality. Hartwell and Associates wasn't just a multinational corporation. It was a battlefield where ambition wore three-piece suits and kindness was often mistaken for weakness. The air was thick with the scent of burnt coffee and the tension that comes when everyone's fighting for the same spotlight. Rachel had been swimming in these corporate waters for 3 years, and she'd learned that staying afloat meant more than just doing good work. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any inspiring stories like this one. Share it with someone who needs to believe that kindness is still worth it. Whispers echoed through the corridors like wildfire, carrying rumors about the mysterious new CEO who'd been appointed but hadn't officially introduced himself yet. Some said he was a ruthless cost-cutter from the West Coast. Others claimed he was a young hotshot who'd revolutionize everything overnight. The uncertainty had everyone on edge, walking on eggshells and polishing their resumes just in case. Rachel felt the collective anxiety pressing down on her shoulders like a weighted blanket she couldn't shake off. While her colleagues schemed and networked their way through lunch meetings and after-work drinks, Rachel stuck to what she knew best: genuine human connection. She was the one who remembered birthdays, brought soup when someone was sick, and actually listened when people needed to vent about their problems. It wasn't a strategy, it was simply who she was. But in a world where every interaction felt calculated, her authenticity made her stand out like a lighthouse in a storm, visible, but sometimes dangerously exposed. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors as Rachel noticed him again, that quiet man she'd met in the elevator. He moved through the office like a ghost, observing everything with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see right through the corporate facade. There was something unsettling, yet comforting about his presence, like he belonged everywhere and nowhere at the same time. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was studying them all, cataloguing their behaviors like a scientist watching lab rats. Her desk was positioned perfectly to witness the daily theater of office politics: Lucas Rodriguez schmoozing with the VP of Marketing, Sarah Chen desperately trying to get FaceTime with department heads, and the endless parade of brown noses who treated every conversation like a chess move. Rachel watched it all unfold while she organized her files with military precision, each document a small piece of the larger puzzle she was trying to solve in her career. The irony wasn't lost on her that in a place designed for collaboration, everyone seemed to be playing a solo game. The weight of proving herself pressed against Rachel's chest like a stone she couldn't cough up. Being a first-generation college graduate and a woman in a male-dominated industry meant every mistake was magnified, every success questioned. She'd learned to work twice as hard for half the recognition, but that hadn't hardened her heart. If anything, it had made her more determined to lift others up along the way. The corporate ladder felt more like a tightrope some days, and she was walking it without a safety net. Lucas had been particularly venomous lately, his comments sharp as broken glass whenever she tried to contribute in meetings. "Maybe we should let the professionals handle this one, Rachel," he'd say, with that practiced smile that never reached his eyes. She'd learned to bite her tongue and channel her frustration into her work, but each snide remark chipped away at her confidence like water eroding stone. The worst part was watching others nod along, afraid to stand up for what was right. As she glanced toward the mystery man again, she noticed he was jotting something down in a leather notebook, his expression thoughtful and calculating. There was an intensity about him that reminded her of her grandfather, a man who'd built his own business from nothing and could read people like open books. She wondered what he was writing about, what observations he was recording about their little corporate soap opera. Something told her his notes weren't about quarterly reports or budget projections. The day stretched ahead like an emotional marathon. She wasn't sure she had the stamina to finish. Between the pressure to excel, the politics to navigate, and the constant need to prove her worth, Rachel felt like she was drowning in shallow water, surrounded by people but struggling to breathe. Yet something about that quiet observer gave her an odd sense of comfort, as if someone was finally paying attention to what really mattered in this place. She couldn't have imagined that her simple act of kindness would soon be put to the ultimate test. In a game of power, is empathy a weakness or a strength? The answer would come sooner than Rachel ever expected. Rachel Martinez carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd learned early that life doesn't hand out participation trophies. At 29, she had the kind of eyes that held stories, deep brown pools that reflected both the weight of her struggles and the unshakable hope that kept her moving forward. Her mother, Maria, had raised her single-handedly after her father walked out when Rachel was 12, leaving behind nothing but empty promises and a half-finished treehouse in their backyard. Those abandonment scars had taught Rachel to be fiercely independent, but they'd also made her treasure genuine connections, like rare jewels. Every morning, Rachel stood in front of her bathroom mirror in her modest one-bedroom apartment, straightening her blazer and reminding herself that she belonged in those corporate halls. The reflection staring back at her was that of a woman who'd clawed her way out of a neighborhood where dreams went to die. Armed with nothing but determination and a business degree she'd earned working 3 jobs. Her morning ritual included a whispered pep talk. "You've got this, girl. Show them what you're made of." It was part prayer, part battle cry, and entirely necessary. The commute to work was her thinking time, 45 minutes on the subway where she'd review her goals, plan her day, and sometimes just watch the city wake up through smudged windows. Rachel had learned to find beauty in the mundane, whether it was the way sunlight streamed through skyscrapers or the rhythm of train wheels on tracks. Her colleagues often complained about the commute, but for Rachel, it was meditation in motion. She'd use that time to center herself, knowing she'd need every ounce of inner strength to navigate the corporate jungle waiting for her. Her desk was a small island of organization in the chaos of the office. Family photos strategically placed, a small succulent that somehow thrived under fluorescent lights, and a motivational quote her mother had written on a sticky note, "Mija, kindness is never wasted." Rachel's workspace told the story of someone who hadn't forgotten where she came from, even as she reached for something bigger. She kept her grandmother's rosary in the top drawer, not necessarily for religious reasons, but as a reminder that faith comes in many forms. The weight of being the family's first college graduate pressed on Rachel's shoulders like an invisible crown, beautiful but heavy. Every promotion she didn't get, every idea that was passed over, every time she was talked over in meetings, it felt like she was letting down not just herself, but generations of women who dreamed of opportunities like this. Her mother cleaned offices at night to help pay for Rachel's education, and that sacrifice was never far from her mind. Success wasn't just personal ambition. It was a debt of love she was determined to repay. Rachel's approach to relationships was like her approach to everything else, authentic and wholehearted. She didn't have time for games or pretense. Life had taught her that genuine connections were too precious to waste on superficial interactions. When she asked someone how they were doing, she actually listened to the answer. When she offered help, she meant it. In a world of LinkedIn networking and strategic friendships, Rachel's sincerity was both refreshing and sometimes misunderstood as naivety. The mystery man from the elevator had been occupying her thoughts more than she cared to admit. There was something about his quiet confidence that reminded her of her grandfather, a man who'd spoken little but commanded respect through his actions. She found herself wondering about his story. What had shaped those observant eyes and that measured way of moving through the world? In a building full of people trying to be noticed, he seemed content to blend into the background, and that intrigued her more than any flashy presentation ever could. Her dreams were simple but profound. She wanted to lead projects that actually mattered, to be the kind of boss who remembered her employees' kids' names, to build something lasting that would make her mother proud. Rachel didn't dream of corner offices or executive parking spaces. She dreamed of making a difference, of proving that nice girls could finish first without losing their souls in the process. Her vision of success looked nothing like the corporate ladder most people were climbing. It looked like a bridge connecting people and possibilities. As she organized her files that morning, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to shift in her carefully ordered world. The quiet observer had been watching them all, and there was an electricity in the air that made her skin tingle with anticipation. She'd always trusted her instincts. They'd gotten her this far, and right now, they were telling her that this unassuming man might be more important than anyone realized. Little did she know that her simple act of kindness would soon reveal just how right her intuition had been. Why does a stranger feel so familiar? Sometimes the most important connections happen when we're not even trying to make them. The day started going sideways the moment Rachel spotted the mystery man by the coffee station, looking lost and slightly overwhelmed by the industrial-strength espresso machine that had claimed more victims than victories. Without thinking twice, she walked over with her usual warm smile and said, "First day navigating our caffeine fortress? Trust me, this thing's got more settings than a spaceship, but I've got the cheat codes." She demonstrated the sequence of buttons like a seasoned barista, her movements confident and welcoming. The man watched intently, those sharp eyes taking in not just her instructions, but the genuine kindness behind them. "Thanks," he said simply, his voice carrying a quiet authority that seemed at odds with his unassuming appearance. "I'm still getting the lay of the land around here." Rachel found herself studying his face for a moment. There was something about his calm demeanor that felt like still water running deep. She handed him a perfectly brewed cup and said, "Well, if you need any other survival tips for this place, I'm Rachel Martinez, and I've been navigating these corporate waters for a while now." He accepted the coffee with a nod that felt more like a small bow of respect, and for some reason, that simple gesture made her day feel a little brighter. Meanwhile, Lucas Rodriguez was holding court by the water cooler, his voice carrying just loud enough for Rachel to hear his commentary. "Some people around here spend way too much time playing welcome wagon instead of focusing on actual work." His cronies chuckled on cue like a laugh track for his one-man show of passive aggression. Rachel felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she'd learned that responding to Lucas's jabs only gave him more ammunition. Instead, she channeled her frustration into organizing her desk with military precision, each file folder placed with the kind of deliberate care that comes from needing something to control. The quarterly presentation was looming like a storm cloud on Rachel's horizon, and she could feel the pressure building in her temples. She'd been working on the market analysis for weeks, poring over data until the numbers blurred together like abstract art. Every graph had to be perfect, every recommendation bulletproof, because she knew that one mistake would be magnified under the microscope of office politics. Her computer screen glowed with spreadsheets and charts that represented months of research, but somehow it still felt like she was building a house of cards in a windstorm. During her lunch break, Rachel noticed the quiet newcomer sitting alone in the corner of the cafeteria, a leather notebook open beside his sandwich. Something about his solitude reminded her of her own early days at the company, when she'd felt like an outsider, pressing her nose against the glass of an exclusive club. She grabbed her salad and walked over, asking, "Mind if I join you? The power lunch crowd can get pretty intense over there." He gestured to the empty chair with a slight smile that transformed his entire face, making him look less mysterious and more human. "You don't have to babysit the new guy," he said, but there was warmth in his voice that suggested he appreciated the gesture. "I'm just catching up on some reading." Rachel glanced at his notebook and caught a glimpse of what looked like organizational charts and notes about company culture, the kind of detailed observations that spoke to a methodical mind. "Trust me, I'm not babysitting," she replied with a laugh. "I'm being selfish. You're probably the only person in this building who hasn't heard my presentation pitch 17 times already." As they talked, Rachel found herself sharing more than she'd intended. Her frustrations with the workplace dynamics, her dreams of leading meaningful projects, her belief that business success and human decency didn't have to be mutually exclusive. The man listened with the kind of attention that's becoming extinct in the age of smartphones and split focus, asking thoughtful questions that made her think deeper about her own motivations. "It sounds like you're fighting an uphill battle," he observed, and Rachel nodded. "Sometimes it feels like I'm swimming upstream in a river full of piranhas." The afternoon brought fresh challenges as Rachel discovered that Lucas had somehow gotten wind of her presentation topic and was now working on a suspiciously similar project. The realization hit her like a cold slap. He was either incredibly coincidental in his thinking or he'd been doing some creative eavesdropping. She could feel her competitive instincts kicking in, that familiar fire in her belly that had gotten her through countless obstacles before. But this time felt different, more personal, like Lucas wasn't just competing with her work, but challenging her entire philosophy of how business should be done. By 5 o'clock, Rachel's stress levels were reaching peak altitude, and she could feel the familiar tension headache creeping up the back of her neck like unwelcome fingers. She was gathering her things when she noticed the mystery man was still there, now standing near the elevators with that same observant expression he wore like a comfortable sweater. Their eyes met across the bustling office floor, and he gave her a small nod. Not pity, not sympathy, but something that felt like recognition. It was the kind of acknowledgement that said, "I see you working hard, and it matters." And somehow that simple gesture was exactly what she needed to face tomorrow's battles. How far can kindness stretch before it snaps under pressure? Rachel was about to find out that some tests come disguised as ordinary Tuesday afternoons. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Rachel feel like anything was possible, and she decided it was time to stop playing defense and start making some real moves. She'd spent the entire night refining her presentation, adding what she thought were game-changing insights that would finally get her noticed by the higher-ups. Armed with a fresh cup of coffee and renewed determination, she spotted the mystery man by the copy machine, looking like he was wrestling with technology that had clearly gotten the better of him. "Need a hand with that beast?" she asked, rolling up her sleeves, with the confidence of someone who'd tamed that particular machine countless times before. "I'd appreciate it," he replied, stepping aside with a gesture that somehow managed to be both gracious and humble. As Rachel worked her magic on the temperamental copier, she noticed he was duplicating what looked like employee handbook pages, the kind of reading material that would put most people to sleep, but that he seemed to be studying with scholarly intensity. "Heavy reading for a Tuesday," she commented with a grin, and he chuckled, a sound that was warmer and more genuine than she'd expected from someone who usually seemed so reserved. "You know, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," Rachel said as the machine hummed to life, "and I realized I never asked what you thought about this place. I mean, you're getting the full immersion experience pretty quickly." She leaned against the machine, genuinely curious about his perspective as an outsider looking in. His eyes seemed to sharpen with interest, and for a moment she felt like she was being evaluated, not judged, but carefully assessed in a way that made her wonder what criteria he was using. "It's illuminating," he said finally, choosing his words with the precision of someone who understood their weight. "I'm seeing how people really operate when they think nobody important is watching. Dosage, there was something in his tone that made Rachel pause, a depth that suggested he wasn't just talking about office gossip or water-cooler politics. "And what's your verdict so far?" she asked, half joking but entirely curious about what conclusions he'd drawn from his observations. The conversation was interrupted by Lucas's voice carrying across the office like nails on a chalkboard. "Rachel, I hope you're not spending all your time on orientation duty when we've got real work to do." The comment was delivered with his trademark smile that never quite reached his eyes, and Rachel felt that familiar surge of frustration mixed with embarrassment. She'd been hoping to make a good impression on the new guy, and here was Lucas making her look like she was slacking off when she was actually trying to be helpful. "Actually," the mystery man said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made Lucas's smirk falter slightly, "Rachel's been incredibly helpful in getting me up to speed. It's exactly the kind of mentorship that builds strong teams." The way he said it wasn't confrontational, but there was steel beneath the silk, and Rachel found herself looking at him with new eyes. Lucas muttered something about team building and walked away, but not before shooting Rachel a look that promised this wasn't over. Later that afternoon, Rachel decided to take a bigger risk and approached her supervisor, Janet Walsh, with her ideas for streamlining the client onboarding process. She'd prepared a whole presentation, complete with flowcharts and efficiency metrics that she was sure would demonstrate her strategic thinking. Janet listened politely, nodding at appropriate intervals, but Rachel could see the familiar glazed look that meant her words were bouncing off like rain on a windshield. "These are interesting thoughts, Rachel," Janet said finally, "but we need to focus on proven systems right now, not experimental approaches." Oh. The rejection stung more than Rachel had expected, especially since she'd watched less qualified colleagues get green lights for half-baked ideas just because they had the right connections or the perfect timing. She walked back to her desk, feeling like she'd just run face first into a glass door she hadn't seen coming. The mystery man was there, quietly observing the interaction from his temporary workstation, and she wondered if he'd witnessed her professional stumble. The thought made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "Sometimes the best ideas come at the worst times," he said quietly as she passed his desk, not looking up from his work, but clearly speaking to her. "The trick is knowing when to plant seeds and when to wait for the right season." Rachel paused, struck by the unexpected wisdom in his words and the way he seemed to understand her frustration without her having to explain it. "Yeah, well," she replied, trying to keep her voice light, "I'm still working on my timing." He looked up then, and his smile was encouraging in a way that made her believe maybe her season was coming sooner than she thought. What happens when the right person finally starts paying attention to what you've been saying all along? Rachel was about to discover that some seeds take root in the most unexpected soil. Over the next few days, Rachel found herself unconsciously looking for the mystery man in the hallways, elevator banks, and meeting rooms where he seemed to materialize like some kind of corporate ghost. She'd catch glimpses of him in departmental briefings, always positioned at the back of the room, where he could observe without being observed, his leather notebook ever present, and his attention laser-focused on whoever was speaking. What struck her most was how he listened, not the polite, waiting for your turn to talk kind of listening that dominated most business conversations, but the deep, absorbing kind that made speakers unconsciously straighten their shoulders and choose their words more carefully. "You know, I've been wondering," Rachel said during one of their increasingly frequent coffee encounters, "what's your take on all this corporate theater we're swimming in?" She gestured toward the glass conference room, where Lucas was performing what looked like an interpretive dance of quarterly projections for a group of glazed-eyed executives. The mystery man followed her gaze and chuckled, that same warm sound that was becoming as familiar as her morning alarm. "I'd say it's fascinating how much energy people spend on the performance versus the actual work," he replied, and Rachel felt that spark of recognition that comes when someone finally gets it. Their conversations began to flow with the easy rhythm of old friends catching up, despite the fact that she still didn't know his name or his official role in the company. He had a way of asking questions that made her think deeper about her own motivations and goals, not in a therapist-y way, but like someone who genuinely wanted to understand what made her tick. "What made you choose this field?" he asked one day, and Rachel found herself telling him about her mother's late-night cleaning jobs and her determination to build something better for both of them. "There's this framed quote in the lobby," he said during another of their impromptu discussions, pointing toward the main entrance where inspirational corporate speak decorated the marble walls. "It says something about authentic leadership through service. Do you think that's just marketing fluff, or is there something to it?" Rachel considered the question seriously, watching the parade of executives march past with their power suits and practiced smiles. "I think it's possible," she said finally, "but it requires people to actually care more about results than recognition, and that's pretty rare around here." The way his eyes lit up when she said that made Rachel feel like she'd passed some kind of test she didn't know she was taking. "Rare, but not impossible," he replied, and something in his tone suggested he'd seen examples of that kind of leadership before. She found herself wondering about his background. What kind of experiences had shaped his perspective on corporate culture and human nature? Every conversation left her with more questions than answers, but somehow that made their interactions more intriguing rather than frustrating. Meanwhile, Lucas had ramped up his campaign of professional undermining to an art form, making snide comments about Rachel's time management priorities and her tendency to get distracted by every new face that walks through the door. His latest masterpiece was a carefully crafted email to their supervisor, CCing half the department, questioning whether Rachel's mentoring activities were impacting her productivity. The passive-aggressive language was perfectly calibrated, professional enough to avoid HR scrutiny, but pointed enough to plant seeds of doubt about her focus. Rachel felt the familiar knot in her stomach as she read Lucas's email, the kind of tension that comes when you realize someone is actively working against you while smiling to your face. But when she looked up from her computer screen, she saw the mystery man watching her with an expression of quiet understanding. He didn't say anything, didn't need to, but his steady presence felt like an anchor in the storm of office politics. "Some battles choose you," he said quietly as he passed her desk later. "And when they do, you have to decide what you're really fighting for." That afternoon, Rachel made a decision that surprised even herself. She invited the mystery man to grab lunch outside the office, away from the fishbowl environment where every conversation was potential gossip fuel. They walked to a small cafe 3 blocks away, where the only corporate influence was the occasional businessman checking his phone between bites of sandwich. "I realized I don't even know your name," Rachel said with a laugh that felt lighter than air. "And here I am sharing my life story with a complete stranger." Sometimes it's easier to be honest with someone who doesn't have preconceived notions about who you're supposed to be," he replied, and Rachel felt the truth of that statement settle into her bones like warm honey. They spent the hour talking about everything except work, her childhood dreams, his thoughts on what makes organizations truly successful, their shared belief that kindness shouldn't be considered a professional weakness. When they walked back to the office, Rachel felt like she'd found something she hadn't realized she'd been looking for, someone who saw the world through similar eyes, even if they came from completely different places. Who is this man who seems to see straight through the corporate masks everyone else wears? Rachel was about to learn that the most important connections often happen when you're not trying to impress anyone. The night before her big presentation, Rachel was burning the midnight oil in her cramped apartment, surrounded by printed charts and empty coffee cups that told the story of weeks of preparation. She'd been over every slide at least 50 times, rehearsing transitions and anticipating questions until the words felt like they were permanently etched in her brain. This wasn't just any presentation. It was her shot at finally proving she belonged at the grown-ups table. her chance to show that all those late nights and weekend work sessions had been building towards something meaningful. The presentation was scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp, and she triple-checked that all her files were uploaded and ready to go. At 6:47 a.m., Rachel's phone buzzed with an email that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. The message was from the IT department, informing her that there had been a system glitch overnight that corrupted several files in the shared drive, including her presentation. The casual, technical language of the email didn't match the absolute panic that was now coursing through her system like electricity. She rushed to her laptop, fingers flying over the keyboard as she frantically searched for backup files, cached versions, anything that might salvage weeks of work. What she found was worse than a simple system crash. Someone had deliberately altered her data, changing key figures and switching out her carefully researched market analysis with outdated information that would make her look incompetent at best and dishonest at worst. The fingerprints were all over Lucas's handiwork, from the subtle changes that would be hard to catch in a quick review to the timing that left her no opportunity to fix things before the meeting. Rachel felt like she was drowning in her own apartment, gasping for air as the walls seemed to close in around her. The tears came hard and fast, mixing frustration with exhaustion and rage with despair, until she couldn't tell where one emotion ended and another began. She'd been so careful, so thorough, so determined to do everything right, and now she was facing professional humiliation because someone had decided to play dirty. Her hands shook as she tried to reconstruct her presentation from memory, but the numbers wouldn't come back clearly, and every chart she tried to recreate looked like a pale imitation of what she'd originally created. Time was slipping away like sand through her fingers, and she could feel her career aspirations crumbling along with it. By 7:30 a.m., Rachel had managed to cobble together a barely passable version of her presentation, but it felt like trying to paint a masterpiece with crayons and construction paper. She stumbled into the office looking like she'd been hit by a truck, her usual polished appearance replaced by the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd been through an emotional blender. Her colleagues noticed, some with sympathy, others with the kind of schadenfreude that thrives in competitive environments. But Rachel was too exhausted to care about appearances anymore. As she sat in her cubicle, staring at the inadequate presentation on her screen, she felt a presence beside her and looked up to see the mystery man standing there with a concerned expression. "Rough night?" he asked, and the gentle kindness in his voice was almost enough to make her start crying again. "You could say that," she replied, her voice cracking like thin ice. "Someone decided to play games with my presentation, and now I'm about to walk into that boardroom looking like an amateur." She gestured helplessly at her computer screen, where months of work had been reduced to a shadow of its former self. "I saw you working on this project," he said quietly, settling into the chair beside her desk. The original research was impressive, thorough, insightful, exactly the kind of strategic thinking this company needs. Rachel looked at him with surprise, wondering how he'd managed to see her work when she'd been so careful to keep it under wraps. "That's nice of you to say," she replied, "but it doesn't change the fact that I'm about to bomb in front of the entire executive team with this patched-together mess." The mystery man was quiet for a moment, his eyes focused on something beyond her shoulder, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made her pay attention. "You know what I've learned about presentations?" he said, leaning forward slightly. "The data is important, but what really matters is the person delivering it. Your passion, your understanding of the issues, your ability to connect with people, that's what makes the difference between a good presentation and a memorable one." His words felt like a life preserver thrown to someone who was already going under, and Rachel found herself holding on to them like they might actually save her. "Easy for you to say," Rachel replied, but without the bitterness she might have felt a few days earlier. "You're not the one who has to walk into that room and explain why your analysis looks like it was done by a college freshman." But even as she said it, she could feel something shifting inside her. a small flame of defiance that refused to be extinguished by Lucas's sabotage. The mystery man smiled, not the pitying smile she'd expected, but something that looked almost like pride. "Truth has a way of making itself known," he said, standing up and straightening his tie. "Sometimes the most important battles are won not with perfect presentations, but with authentic conviction. When everything you've worked for crumbles in one night, what's left to fight with?" Rachel was about to discover that sometimes your greatest strength emerges from your darkest moment. Walking into that boardroom felt like stepping into a gladiator arena, complete with the kind of fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look either dead or dying. Rachel's heart was hammering against her ribs like a caged bird, but she held her head high and arranged her materials with the deliberate precision of someone who decided that grace under pressure was the only weapon she had left. The executive team was already seated around the massive mahogany table, a collection of power suits and poker faces that had probably seen more nervous presentations than she'd had hot dinners. At the head of the table sat the empty chair reserved for the mysterious new CEO, and Rachel couldn't help but wonder if today would finally be the day they'd meet their elusive leader. "Good morning, everyone," Rachel began, her voice steady despite the butterflies performing aerial acrobatics in her stomach. "I know you're expecting a traditional data presentation, but I want to start with something more important: the story behind the numbers." She clicked to her first slide, which instead of charts and graphs showed a simple photograph of the company's lobby on a busy Monday morning. "This is what our clients see when they walk through our doors. The question is, what do they feel?" The room was quiet, but she could sense she had their attention in a way that felt different from the usual polite corporate listening. As Rachel moved through her presentation, something magical began to happen. The words that had felt so rehearsed and artificial in her apartment began to flow with natural passion and conviction. She spoke about market trends, not as abstract concepts, but as real forces affecting real people, transforming dry statistics into human stories that resonated with universal truths. "When we look at this 23% decline in client retention," she said, gesturing to a chart she'd hastily recreated that morning, "we're not just seeing numbers, we're seeing relationships that we failed to nurture, trust that we didn't earn, and opportunities that we let slip through our fingers because we were too busy chasing the next deal to take care of the ones we already had." The executives were leaning forward now, their usual boardroom boredom replaced by genuine engagement, and Rachel felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that comes when you know you're hitting your target. She'd always been a natural storyteller, but corporate life had taught her to bury that instinct under layers of professional jargon and risk-averse language. Today, with nothing left to lose, she was speaking from the heart instead of the handbook, and the difference was electric. "The solution isn't more aggressive sales tactics or flashier marketing campaigns," she continued. "It's about remembering that every client interaction is a chance to build something lasting, something that matters." Halfway through her presentation, Rachel noticed movement at the back of the room and glanced over to see the mystery man entering quietly, taking a seat in the corner where he could observe without disrupting the flow of her talk. His presence was like a shot of confidence straight to her bloodstream, reminding her of their conversation about authentic leadership and the power of genuine connection. She caught his eye for just a moment, and he gave her the slightest nod of encouragement. Not enough to distract from her presentation, but enough to remind her that at least one person in the room understood what she was really trying to say. "I know some of you are probably wondering about the technical details and implementation costs," Rachel said, addressing the elephant in the room with the kind of directness that would have terrified her a week ago. "And yes, this approach requires an investment in training, in culture change, in systems that prioritize long-term relationships over short-term profits." She paused, letting the weight of that statement settle over the room like morning mist. "But I know That companies who make this investment don't just survive in today's market, they thrive. They become the kind of organizations that people want to work for, buy from, and partner with. The questions came fast and sharp, the kind of probing inquiries that separate the prepared from the pretenders, and Rachel found herself fielding them with a confidence she didn't know she possessed. When the CFO challenged her revenue projections, she didn't fumble for spreadsheets or statistical models. She told him about the 3 clients she'd personally saved from jumping ship by simply listening to their concerns and addressing them with creativity instead of corporate policy. When the VP of Operations questioned her implementation timeline, she painted a picture of gradual transformation that acknowledged the complexity of change while maintaining focus on measurable results. Lucas, who'd been conspicuously quiet throughout the presentation, finally spoke up with a question that was clearly designed to expose the holes in her hastily reconstructed data. "Rachel, I'm concerned about the accuracy of some of these figures, given the technical difficulties with the original files," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "How can we make strategic decisions based on potentially compromised information?" The room went quiet, and Rachel felt that familiar surge of anger rise in her chest. But instead of letting it consume her, she channeled it into something more powerful. "You know what, Lucas?" Rachel said, her voice calm, but carrying the kind of steel that makes smart people pay attention. "You're absolutely right to question the data. In fact, I'm glad you brought that up because it gives me a chance to address something more important than any spreadsheet." She looked around the room, making eye contact with each executive in turn. "The numbers in this presentation might not be perfect, but the insights they represent are based on 3 years of working directly with our clients, of seeing what works and what doesn't, of understanding that behind every data point is a human being who chose to trust us with their business. That's not something you can corrupt or manipulate. That's institutional knowledge, and it's the most valuable asset this company has. When you have nothing left to lose, you discover what you're truly made of." Rachel was about to learn that sometimes the most powerful presentations happen when you stop trying to impress people and start trying to change them. The applause that followed Rachel's presentation was the kind that starts tentatively and builds into something genuine. Not the polite golf claps that usually punctuated boardroom meetings, but the appreciative recognition of people who just witnessed something unexpected and impressive. Rachel felt her cheeks flush with a mixture of relief and pride as she gathered her materials, her hands finally steady after the adrenaline-fueled performance she'd just delivered. The executives were murmuring among themselves with the animated energy that follows truly engaging presentations. And for the first time in months, Rachel felt like she might actually have a future at this company that extended beyond her current cubicle. "Before we adjourn," came a voice from the head of the table, and Rachel looked up to see the board chairman, Robert Mitchell, standing with the kind of gravitas that comes with decades of corporate leadership. "I'd like to take this opportunity to officially introduce our new Chief Executive Officer, who's been conducting his own assessment of our company culture and operations over the past several weeks." Rachel's heart skipped a beat as she realized what was happening, her eyes automatically scanning the room for clues about which of the suited executives would step forward to claim the title. The mystery man rose from his corner seat with fluid grace, straightening his tie and walking toward the front of the room with the confident stride of someone who'd always belonged there, but had simply chosen to observe from the shadows. Rachel's world tilted on its axis as recognition crashed over her like a tsunami. This quiet, observant man who'd been asking thoughtful questions about company culture and authentic leadership wasn't some junior employee or curious consultant. He was Ethan Carter, the new CEO whose arrival had been the source of months of speculation, gossip, and anxiety throughout the entire organization. "Thank you, Robert," Ethan said, his voice carrying the same warm authority Rachel had grown accustomed to during their coffee conversations, but now amplified by the weight of his true position. I've spent the last 3 weeks getting to know this company, not from boardrooms and executive briefings, but from the ground up, talking to employees, observing interactions, understanding how our values translate into daily practice. His eyes swept the room, landing briefly on Rachel, with an expression that managed to be both professional and reassuring at the same time. Rachel felt like she was watching a movie of her own life, unable to process the magnitude of what was unfolding before her. Every conversation they'd had, every casual comment about leadership and authenticity, every moment she'd treated him as an equal rather than a superior, it all took on new meaning now. The man she'd offered coffee tips to was the same person who could make or break her career with a single decision. The quiet observer she'd shared her frustrations with was the new leader of the entire organization. The blood drained from her face as she realized how vulnerable she'd been, how much she'd revealed to someone whose true identity she'd never suspected. "During my time here," Ethan continued, his gaze moving deliberately around the room, "I've had the opportunity to observe how different people respond to change, uncertainty, and challenge. I've seen employees who retreat into self-preservation mode, others who use uncertainty as an opportunity for political maneuvering, and still others who continue to embody our stated values regardless of external circumstances." The boardroom was absolutely silent now, everyone hanging on his words with the kind of attention usually reserved for earnings announcements and merger discussions. "Rachel Martinez," Ethan said, and hearing her name spoken aloud in that context made her feel like she'd been struck by lightning. "You were the only person in this entire organization who treated me with genuine kindness and respect without knowing who I was or what I could do for your career." The words hung in the air, like a challenge to everyone else in the room, an implicit critique of organizational behavior that was as elegant as it was devastating. Rachel could feel every eye in the room fixed on her, and she wasn't sure whether she wanted to disappear through the floor or stand up and take a bow. "Your presentation this morning wasn't just impressive because of its content," Ethan continued, his voice gaining strength and conviction with each word. "It was impressive because it demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking this company needs: strategic vision combined with genuine care for people, analytical rigor balanced with emotional intelligence, and the courage to speak truth even when it's uncomfortable." Rachel felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from embarrassment, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being seen and understood for who she really was. "Therefore," Ethan said, pausing for dramatic effect in a way that would have made any theatre director proud, "I'm pleased to announce that Rachel will be leading our new Customer Experience Excellence Initiative, reporting directly to me and working with a hand-picked team to implement the vision she's outlined today." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Lucas's pen clattering to the table as his jaw dropped in what looked like physical shock. Rachel felt like she was floating outside her own body, watching this surreal scene unfold with the detached amazement of someone witnessing a miracle they'd never dared to hope for. How can a simple mistake in judgment become the opportunity of a lifetime? Sometimes the people we overlook are the ones who see us most clearly. The corridor was unusually quiet, the fluorescent lights above casting sharp lines across the floor as Rachel stepped out of the boardroom. Her body was still humming with adrenaline, but her soul felt calm. For the first time in weeks, she had done it, spoken her truth, held her ground, and been seen. But just as she reached for the elevator button, she heard footsteps, quick, hard ones, coming from behind. Lucas's voice hit her like a cold slap. "Well, congratulations," he said, his words dripping with venom. "Guess all it takes is coffee chats and pity stories to get ahead these days." "Who knew?" Rachel turned slowly, her expression unreadable. "Excuse me?" "Oh, come on," he scoffed. "Do you really expect me to believe this promotion was about merit? You got lucky. Right place, right time, right audience." She stared at him for a beat, her breath steady. "You think this was luck?" she said, her voice soft but sharp as glass. Luck is what happens when you work hard and treat people with respect. You call it luck, I call it character. Lucas's smirk faltered just slightly, but before he could retort, a third voice entered the space, cool, clear, and unmistakably in control. I believe that's enough, Mr. Rodriguez. Ethan Carter's presence seemed to drain the air from the hallway. He stepped between them with a calm authority that silenced Lucas mid-breath. Dressed in the same simple suit as always, he didn't raise his voice or change his posture. He didn't need to. His eyes, however, were steel. Rachel has earned everything that's come her way, Ethan continued, and if you can't see that, perhaps you're not as observant as your resume claims. Lucas opened his mouth, then thought better of it. With a huff, he turned and walked away, his shoes echoing down the corridor like a retreating threat. Rachel stood frozen, a strange mix of embarrassment and relief twisting in her chest. She wasn't used to being defended. She wasn't used to being believed. Ethan turned to her, his tone softening. I've watched you since day one, not because of what you said, but how you carried yourself. You didn't know who I was. You didn't try to impress me. You just showed up every day as yourself. That's rare. She searched his face, looking for any trace of condescension. There was none. For what it's worth, he added, I wasn't looking for another executive. I was looking for someone who still believed that people mattered, and I found her. Rachel felt something inside her loosen, like a knot she'd been carrying for years, finally started to unravel. In that moment, she realized her worth was no longer tied to approval, applause, or performance reviews. It had always been within her. Taking the elevator to the top floor no longer felt like a trip into enemy territory. Rachel still carried the weight of responsibility, but now it came with purpose instead of fear. Leading the Customer Experience Excellence Initiative was more than just a promotion. It was a chance to redefine what leadership looked like at Hartwell and Associates. The title on her door was new, but the vision had been growing inside her for years. Her first move wasn't to assert dominance, it was to listen. She scheduled one-on-one meetings with people across departments, from junior assistants to senior managers, asking what they wished leadership understood. At first, they were hesitant, but when they realized she was genuinely listening, not collecting sound bites for a report, but truly hearing them, their walls started to come down. In a company obsessed with metrics, Rachel led with empathy. She built her team with care, choosing people who reflected the diversity she believed was essential for innovation, not just culturally, but in thought, in temperament, in perspective. She didn't chase resumes filled with buzzwords. She looked for quiet brilliance, overlooked talent, people who still believed work could mean something. Soon, her office became a hive of ideas, laughter, and real collaboration. Naturally, not everyone was quick to embrace the change. Some colleagues whispered about favoritism, others tested her authority. But Rachel never wavered. She didn't lead by force. She led by showing up, with grace, with boundaries, with consistent values. And little by little, even the skeptics began to soften. Ethan remained close, but never hovering. He offered guidance when needed, sometimes through a shared glance in a meeting, other times through late-night messages with encouragement or strategy. In one of their conversations, he opened up about his own rise. I used to think I had to pretend to be someone tougher, he said. Then I realized the only way to lead people well is to be real with them, especially when it's hard. Rachel carried that with her. She stopped trying to fit the mold and focused instead on embodying what she wished more leaders had been for her: human, consistent, unafraid to care. Her confidence no longer needed to be loud, to be powerful. It came from alignment. Who she was finally matched how she showed up. One afternoon, after a team workshop, Sarah Chen lingered behind and said, I used to feel invisible in this place. Now I actually feel like I matter. Rachel didn't know what to say at first, only that something inside her swelled with quiet joy. This was the impact she'd always hoped to make. She pinned a handwritten note beside her desk, one her mother had mailed her years ago. True strength is kindness with boundaries. It wasn't strategy, it wasn't optics, it was her compass. And in following it, Rachel became the kind of leader she had always needed. The boardroom looked different this time, brighter maybe, or perhaps it was Rachel who had changed. The chairs were the same, the projector hummed with familiar static, and yet the energy was undeniable. People leaned in, eyes lit up. Laughter flowed freely between data points. The presentation she was delivering wasn't just being heard, it was being felt. It had been 6 months since she first stepped into that same room, trembling with fear and carrying a sabotage slide deck. Today, she stood tall, centered, grounded. The Customer Experience Excellence Initiative had exceeded expectations. Client retention was up, employee satisfaction had risen, and perhaps most importantly, people were talking to each other like humans again. Culture was shifting, and Rachel was leading it. When the final slide faded and the room erupted into applause, Rachel didn't smile out of pride, but out of peace. She had done something real. Not for recognition, not for validation, but because she had believed it could be done. She thanked her team and gracefully stepped down from the front, letting them receive the spotlight too. That, she'd learned, was part of real leadership, knowing when to lift others. After the meeting, Ethan approached her with 2 coffees in hand. "You've earned this," he said with a soft smile, motioning toward the terrace just outside the glass wall. The autumn sun filtered through the trees, casting golden light across the stone floor as they stepped outside. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Ethan spoke again. "Do you remember the elevator? First day?" She laughed. "You looked completely lost in front of the espresso machine." He chuckled, then said more seriously, "That wasn't an accident. I came in quiet on purpose. I needed to see who people were when they thought I wasn't watching." Rachel nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling. "So all of it true was a test?" "Not a test," he said. "An opportunity to find someone who leads with substance, not performance. You reminded me that titles mean nothing without integrity. You reminded me why I still believe in people." Her heart swelled, not just from his words, but from the calm assurance in his tone. For so long, she had believed she needed to fight to be seen. Now she knew. Being seen wasn't the reward. Being herself was. "I thought success would feel louder," she admitted. "But this quiet satisfaction, I think it's better." Ethan raised his coffee. "To quiet revolutions, then." Rachel clinked her cup gently against his, the autumn breeze brushing past like a soft exhale from the universe. She didn't know exactly what came next, but for the first time, she wasn't chasing anything. She was building from truth, from kindness, from the fierce belief that who you are is always enough. Sometimes, all someone needs is a chance, and someone who sees beyond appearances. If this story touched your heart, leave a like, share it with someone who believes in the power of empathy, and subscribe for more stories that prove true strength comes from within. Tell us in the comments, what act of kindness changed the course of your life?